Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to History Class, live from my yard. Decided to show you a different side of the yard today. Kind of change it up on you, give some variety. I'm going to try to keep it a little shorter today, because today, the period we're talking about here today is the kind of the Carter years between 76 to 80, which really is a bridge kind of between eras to some extent. The Jimmy Carter presidency is going to be a continuation of the détente era, but it's also going to be perhaps a sign that the détente thing ultimately failed. You know, at the time, everyone was very excited about it because it seemed like there's a little bit less of nuclear Armageddon just hanging in the air than there was during the 50s and 60s. But by the time Reagan is running for president in 1980, you know, there's a real case to be made that America's position of strength in the world had been compromised, and Reagan exploited that thought by saying, you know, I'm going to strengthen it, and he did just that. We'll talk about him in the next 2 days, since he's the greatest president who ever lived, at least since Lincoln, if not since Washington, and I'm generally not a fan of dictatorship, but if I could raise Ronald Reagan from the dead and make him king, I would probably at least think about it very hard. But nonetheless, we'll pick up our story in 1976 when Gerald Ford is considering running, you might say for re-election, but actually for election, because he had never actually won an election. He had won congressional elections, but he'd never been voted on by the people at a nationwide level. He was appointed by Nixon to replace Spiro T. Agnew, and then Nixon quit, and so he becomes the president that nobody voted for. And he, as we mentioned the other day, he immediately shoots himself in the foot by pardoning Nixon, which was such a controversial decision. So it comes time for Ford. Ford decides that he will seek the nomination for a full term of president. He served for like a year and a half. Maybe it was 2 years after Nixon quit. Yeah, because Nixon quit in 74. So yeah, so right around 2 years. So he served about half of his term. He was eligible for at least for another 4. I think he might have been eligible for another 8. It would have depended on the timing. But because he was less strong of an incumbent than anyone else had been, because he had never really been voted on, some people consider him kind of ripe for a primary challenge. And he faces a primary challenge in the Republican Party. It's very rare that sitting presidents face primary challenges, but it's going to happen in back-to-back years in 76 and 80. So 1976, Ford is challenged for the presidency by the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who had been a major actor in Hollywood. He famously played the coach of Notre Dame in a famous football movie where he had the famous line, "Go win one for the Gipper," which I guess qualified as great screenwriting back in the 1940s or whatever. And then especially for having starred in an awful lot of cowboy movies was especially. So he had been a celebrity, but he also had actually become the head of the Actors Union for a while, and he actually was a former liberal. He was a diehard pro-New Deal FDR guy until he was the head of the union in Hollywood and started to be exposed to the hard left elements of liberalism in the midst of the McCarthy era and all this stuff, and he turns really hard against communism, and that drives him to increasingly starting to realize, in his view, that American Democratic Party brand of liberalism in his mind was not far enough from communism for his taste. So he becomes increasingly conservative until he becomes considered really the successor to Barry Goldwater as the leader of the conservative movement within the Republican Party. And Reagan, by the time he finally becomes president in 1980, he actually had tried an awful lot, because Reagan actually ran against Nixon in the primary in 68, lost to Nixon. He probably would have won in primary elections, but he lost at the convention. Nixon had a lot of friends by then from being vice president and so on. So he lost to Nixon in 68, seeking the nomination. And then he's going to lose to Ford, but he's actually going to get it on his third time. So thank God that he was persistent. But Reagan actually takes Ford down to the wire. It gets really close, and he almost knocks off the sitting president for the nomination. But ultimately, Ford is going to hang on. Meanwhile, over on the Democratic side of the aisle, the Democrats tried an experiment in moderation, having been blown out in 72 in like a 45-state landslide or something like that, with the far-left candidate George McGovern. They corrected severely in trying to move a little bit more to the center, and they picked a surprise candidate. It was not considered one of the favorites going into the race. The governor of Georgia, one Jimmy Carter, who had been a Georgia peanut farmer and Sunday school teacher before eventually finding his way into state politics and becoming governor. And, this was kind of considered a way to kind of reach back out to the South after they started to bolt the Democratic Party in the last two elections. So, ultimately, Carter is going to win. One of the real twists in the race is this famous time in the debate where Ford made the comment that Poland was not under the domination of the Soviet Union, which is one of the most asinine things that anyone has ever said, because it obviously was. And it kind of reinforced kind of a little bit of an image that Ford was getting of kind of not being all the way there. And so Carter winds up winning a pretty close election. Ford, incidentally, is the first president ever to be parodied on Saturday Night Live. That show came out in 1975, and Chevy Chase actually played Gerald Ford, was the first presidential impression on that show. And actually, some people credit Chevy Chase with driving down Gerald Ford's approval ratings, because they really played up this idea that he was this clumsy guy and didn't know what he was talking about, and so on. Carter wins a close election in 76, and he winds up having a pretty turbulent presidency. Now, let me go ahead, to be fair, because I'm about to say a lot of mean things about Jimmy Carter, so I want to take a step back and say some nice things about him before I get into his presidency, because Jimmy Carter, by all accounts, is a very decent human being, a very nice gentleman. He's a good Christian, spends lots of time volunteering for, Habitat for Humanity and building houses for poor people in his spare time. He's a wonderful person. You'd love to have him over for dinner. He's a nice guy. That being said, awful president. Terrible. And kind of just who we didn't need at that time, because the late 70s is going to be a period of time where there's a lot of international turmoil, and Carter was really not the man for the job, which is ultimately going to lead to him only serving one term. So what were some of the things that Carter focused on? A lot of what, one thing about Carter we should say too, when Carter comes in, part of the reason Carter wins is because it was kind of a anti-Washington establishment vote, because he was coming from, a medium-sized state in Georgia, didn't have connections to the Beltway, didn't have connections to Washington, and everyone was kind of sick of everyone in Washington, because we're in the aftermath of the Watergate thing. Now, honestly, the fact that Ford was even competitive in the election in the aftermath of Watergate is honestly shocking to me, because Carter wins a squeaker, really. Nonetheless, Carter comes in, everyone kind of thinks, oh, this is a breath of fresh air, this nice, Georgia peanut farmer, Well, when he gets in there, he doesn't really know what he's doing in the Oval Office, and he winds up starting to micromanage in a way that no president ever should. I mean, there were times, people say that Jimmy Carter would literally answer the phone in the White House at times. The president should never answer a phone call, ever, You have other people screen that for you. If it's important, they patch them on to you. But Carter would sometimes actually pick up the phone himself, and that's just a little snippet of but he really wanted to micromanage everything, wanted to have his hands in everything. It's not that he was lazy. He was actually more like a workaholic, but it didn't work. It's too much of a job. He didn't have the skill of delegation that a lot of presidents have and really need to have. The president is a big job that you can't do all by yourself. Carter kind of tried to do it all by himself, and some of that came from a good place of character, of work ethic and so forth, but it's not actually what people needed. Wasn't the efficient thing. So, in addition, one thing on foreign affairs, Jimmy Carter took a very idealistic view, and I don't entirely fault him for this, because I'm sympathetic to where he's coming from, but I think it caused him to make a few specific strategic mistakes. So, I can't remember if it was this class or the world history class that I shared this quote with earlier, but President Truman used to famously have a quote about the whole moral question of whether we support or don't support governments that are enemies of the Soviet Union, but not governments that we really would like or support, not free countries or whatever. And Truman had this old saying he used to say. He said, well, he may be a son of a gun, shall we say, but he's our son of a gun, shall we say. And that was the opposite of what Carter wanted to do. That's what America had done for much of this time. And Carter said, no, we really want to emphasize not supporting any country that is having human rights violations, so on, whether they're enemies of the Soviets or not. And that's going to make, and we'll come back to that thought in a minute and see how that played out in a big way in the nation of Iran. One thing that Jimmy Carter did that got a lot of Americans off on the wrong foot with him is he agreed to a treaty to hand the Panama Canal Zone over to Panama. He thought it would be a goodwill gesture that would kind of improve, American relations with the Latin American nations. We did it, and it didn't make a tremendous difference. But a lot of people thought that was a dangerous thing to do strategically in the midst of the Cold War, because we had this land free and clear. We helped the Panamanians win their independence from Colombia in exchange for having this stretch of land. Why is giving them this stretch of land going to really help things? So a lot of people were upset about that. There were some people, including President Ford, who also supported the policy. So it would have happened no matter who'd won the '76 election. But, Reagan famously kind of ran against that idea and blamed Carter for that in the election. So that was a controversial thing. One thing that Carter tried to do as well, one thing that Carter did that was an attempt to kind of heal the nation from the turbulent last few years, but that backfired in the minds of a lot of people, especially of the more conservative or more hawkish or bent. Carter issued a blanket pardon for all the Vietnam draft dodgers. And I mean, that got a lot of people angry who had, gone to war and fought and been drafted, and then they come home and, all these rich kids decided they didn't want to go and, fled to Canada or whatever, and now all of a sudden Carter's pardoned them, and I could have done that and got away with it, but no one told me that, So a lot of people were angry about that. Obviously, if you were looking at the Vietnam situation from a pacifist or anti-war perspective where you thought the Vietnam War was unjust, you would say that Carter did a great thing for justice by doing that. But if you look at the Vietnam War as a patriotic duty that we should have been doing, and even though it didn't work out well, we should have fought it, well, then you're going to look at what Carter did and say, man, you let off all these people who didn't do their duty. And so that was a controversial thing. The greatest achievement of the Carter presidency, the best thing that he accomplished, was actually at the diplomatic table, something called the Camp David Accord. So Camp David is a presidential retreat center in Maryland, and it's kind of a place that the president goes to to be able to go on vacation, get some privacy, get away from Washington. I mean, it's set up to where he can conduct business from there. Some presidents, would spend a significant amount of time at Camp David. It's basically a personal resort for the president. And so at the time, Israel and the entire Arab world had been in basically nonstop warfare from 1948 until the present. They had fought major wars in 48, 53, 67, and 73. So there's been 4 major conflicts, intermittent acts of shooting here and there in between the major wars. And for the first time, Anwar el-Sadat, the Egyptian president, becomes the first Muslim leader to decide to make peace with the Israelis and wants to agree to a treaty. So hearing this, President Carter invites the Egyptian president Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to meet him at Camp David to hammer out a peace deal, and he successfully negotiates the Camp David Peace Accords, which grants Israel peace on her southern border, which is huge. Completely changed Israel's security situation going forward. Let Egypt become a little bit more stable. They still have had some ups and downs through the years, but enabled them to have a stable regime for another 25, 30 years after that. Without fear of war with the Israelis. So the Camp David Peace Accords are the highlight of Carter's administration. Another thing he tried to do also on the diplomatic front was he wanted to follow up the SALT, if you remember the SALT treaty that Nixon signed, that kind of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that limited the amount of warheads that the Americans and the Soviet Union could have. Carter wanted to push further and do a treaty that was called SALT II, which would bring that cap down. But SALT II was not very popular with the Republicans at the time. And I don't know, the fact that the Republicans supported SALT 1 and not SALT 2, I don't know if that's a matter of SALT 2 being that much more extreme, or it was just the fact that they went along with a Republican president Nixon and didn't want it from a Democratic president Carter. I'm not real sure which phenomenon was at play there, but certainly there were people in the conservative movement that didn't like SALT 1 when Nixon was there. But SALT 2, regardless, I don't know the motive, but whichever it was, a lot of people thought that SALT 2 was going too far. They thought that the wording of SALT 2 was worded in such a way that it would give the Soviet Union a missile advantage over the United States, which we certainly didn't want. And the thought was that we hadn't done enough to hold the Soviet Union to SALT 1. And so they said, we signed the SALT Treaty. We've got evidence that the Russians have broken it on many occasions. We haven't broken it. So we've kind of been unilaterally disarming, getting rid of some of our warheads, and can't prove that they've gotten rid of theirs. And so a lot of people said, well, let's not do any more arms limitations. I think when Reagan is running in the 80 election, his motto on arms limitations is trust but verify, meaning, yes, we want to have good faith negotiations, but we also need some system of proving that they're keeping it. And Reagan has a reputation, we'll talk about this more tomorrow and Monday, Reagan has a reputation of being this diehard hawk. In reality, he really did support arms limitations and nuclear de-escalation, but he wanted to do it from a position of strength where they would know we meant business. He was a big believer in the speak softly and carry a big stick, whereas Carter was just like, speak softly and hope it works. And so Reagan actually agrees to a lot of this arms control stuff in the back half of the 80s once he figures out a way to get the Soviets to listen to him and trust that they're going to abide by stuff. But that was not the situation in 76. So SALT 2 is not very popular. There's some pushback among Democrats, a lot of it among Republicans. It doesn't look like it's going to pass. And then the thing, but it looks like it has a chance. It's kind of on the border. It's troubled. But then the thing that drives the nail in the coffin of SALT 2 is the moment that ends the détente period. So détente was the period of the thawing of the Cold War, where it looked like America and Russia had kind of de-escalated and kind of accepted each other's existence and started to treat each other as kind of equals and just accepted this is going to be the way it is. The thing that undoes all that happens in 1979. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a communist government. A rebel group emerges that wants to overthrow the communist government and eventually wants to install an Islamist government. They eventually want to become like an Islamic government, but we didn't quite understand the Islamist nature of the revolution at the time. So we actually wound up supporting the rebels against the Soviets. We started giving them a lot of money, and as we'll see over the next couple videos as we get to the end of the Cold War here, the Afghanistan War is considered the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It's a big quagmire that they can't fix. They can't figure out how to get a handle on the situation. They're real liable to the guerrilla warfare the same way we were in Vietnam. Afghanistan, in a lesson that we should have learned from the Russians probably, is very hard land to conquer as a foreigner, because you've got not that we were trying to conquer it per se, but we were trying to get it under control. And it's hard to do that because it's this extraordinarily rugged mountain range. People have this misconception sometimes that Afghanistan looks like Iraq. They're two very different places. Iraq is desert and sand everywhere. Afghanistan is like the Rocky Mountains on steroids out in the Hindu Kush and stuff. So anyway, I'm fixing to get ahead of myself talking about the Afghan War. We'll get to that later. But so the Soviet-Afghan War, which we'll come back to, winds up being a major, major moment in history, both for ending the Cold War and setting up the War on Terror, because it's a part of the origin story of Osama bin Laden, as well as the conclusion of the Soviet Union. So if American history was a long-running TV show that you were binge-watching, you would say that the producers are doing a really good job of kind of teasing the next enemy with simultaneous to to the death of the one bad guy is dying and they're bringing in the new one slowly. So anyway, though, the Afghan war is kind of the end of Daytona. It puts an end to SALT II. It kind of puts us back on the footing of looking at the Soviet Union once again as an aggressive power that's potentially a threat toward other countries. Carter does say that if they push any further south into the Persian Gulf, that he will promise American military resistance against that. He also calls for a couple of he boycotts the 1980 Olympics, which were going to take place in Moscow, and he cuts off American grain sales to the Soviet Union, which actually wound up being a controversial move among American agricultural interests. A lot of farmers lost a lot of money on that. However, a lot of people kind of thought that Carter's response was a little weak-willed. It's like, okay, we stopped selling you food and we won't go to the Olympics, but is that really all you're going to do? He wasn't really taking, he certainly wasn't committing any troops or anything, but people thought that maybe he wasn't playing enough hardball with the Soviet Union. I don't know that people were necessarily calling for us to go fight with the Afghan rebels per se, but a lot of people kind of thought that he could have taken a more severe tone in his diplomacy. I think him being such a nice guy kind of backfired when dealing with hard-nosed communist dictators like Leonid Brezhnev. So the biggest foreign policy setback and the biggest setback of his whole economy, of his whole presidency, though happens just a little bit southwest of Afghanistan in the nation of Iran. I actually just did a whole lecture on this for World History class, so if this catches your fancy and you want more information on it, you can click on that one too. Yeah, tough luck, right? But anyway, so Iran had been a relatively modern nation inside of the Islamic world. If you look at, a news broadcast in Iran from 1975, you'll see, you'll see female news anchors in, the hottest 1970s fashion with makeup and no veil, and then 3 years later, all those women would be walking around in veils. Can you imagine living in a country where everyone had their face covered when you were walking around? Oh, never mind. So, no comment. I didn't say nothing. So anyway, Iran, though, 1979 has a revolution. And the Shah, which was their title for king, the Shah was a bad dude. But he was one of these guys that we had still supported because he was anti-communist, anti-Soviet Union, and Iran has oil. And so we wanted to have a good relationship with him over, for the sake of the oil and also for the sake of not letting him get friendly with the Soviets, because we didn't want them to have Iranian oil and not us. So, anyway, so he was one of these guys that was the son of a gun, but wasn't our son of a gun. And then Carter, because he's trying to emphasize human rights in his foreign policy and stuff, kind of removes the American backing of the regime of Shah Pahlavi, which is this guy's name. So there's three kind of forces unite in Iran, some who were Iranian communist, some who were in favor of democracy, and then some who wanted Islamic government. But the faction that wanted Islamic government took control, particularly under the leadership of a man by the name of Ruhollah Khomeini, who had the title of Ayatollah, which is the highest level of Shiite Islamic priesthood. So Ayatollah Khomeini takes over the country, and I mentioned to my last class, I just did another video on that. To me, Khomeini is the most chilling person, with the exceptions of Hitler and maybe Charles Manson, the serial killer from the 60s. With the exception of those two men, I think Khomeini is probably the third scariest guy to look at in my life. I mean, you look at a picture, I don't know if there's a picture of him in your book or not, you look at a picture of him and you see the raw, cold evil in his eyes, it gives you the creeps. Oh, Khomeini creeps me out. But anyway, he emerges as the leader in Iran and turns Iran into the world's first true Islamic theocratic state since the medieval days. and I mean instills like draconian laws. You know, women can't leave the house without a veil on. Also, can't leave the house without a male chaperone who was a relative. You know, became illegal to listen to any sort of American music, or you know, read American literature. Strong religious persecution of anyone who wasn't a Muslim, or anyone who was the wrong kind of Muslim. Any criticism of the government, obviously, as with any dictatorship. Although Iran did pretend to be a democracy. They did have like elections for president and prime minister and parliament. I mean, but the thing is, the supreme leaders of Iran were actually the Islamic priesthood. Like, they were a true theocracy, and the leader of the leaders was known as the supreme leader. In this case, was Ayatollah Khomeini, and you couldn't run for office without getting the approval of the supreme leader and what they called the Guardian Council. So, you know, you can vote, but you're voting for people that already have the approval of the real leaders behind the throne. So you can kind of vote for which puppet you like, you know. So so they put in this really extreme Iranian government. They even deputized people to like go around with like baseball bats and like beat up, you know, either women that weren't wearing the mask or people who were in discos, because it was that era, which was just god-awful. 1977 is also the day the music died. Lynyrd Skynyrd's plane goes down and rock and roll starts veering downward severely, and then disco starts taking over, and it's just god-awful. It's just terrible. The early 70s are like as good as the late 60s. Like, it's like the combined, like the greatest period of all time is like 67 to 73, and then once it gets like 77, 78, it starts sounding like the 80s, and it's just bad. It's just bad. Anyway, I digress. So this radical Islamic regime comes in Iran, and what happens is Khomeini really positions himself as an opponent of the United States. He starts calling America the Great Satan. And he hated the Americans for a handful of reasons. One, you know, just as a strict Islamic moralist, he kind of thought that America was morally loose and a den of iniquity and so on. Two, there was, you know, they believed in theocratic government and the restoration of the Islamic Caliphate, and thought that democracy, of which we were the world's foremost champion and prophet, was this false system that needed to be brought down. And then number three, they resented American support of the state of Israel in the various Israeli-Arab wars. So there's a group of Iranian radicals that the Iranian government claimed that they were just radical Islamic college students who got fired up and did it, but everyone believes the Iranian government was behind it. They seize the American embassy and take our entire embassy hostage, and they hold them hostage for a year. And it really puts a stranglehold on the Carter administration. The news show Nightline ran, I don't know if it's still running on ABC or not. It ran for at least 30, 35 years. It could still be going, I don't know. But it literally was started to give daily updates on the hostage situation. Nothing could go right in it. One thing that's interesting about the hostage situation, a handful of people escaped from the American embassy to the Canadian embassy, and then we didn't know how to get them out. So the CIA, they made a movie about this called Argo. Ben Affleck, I think, was in it. They changed the ending to make it more dramatic, but the general gist of it is actually true. The CIA created a fake Canadian sci-fi movie called Argo that was supposedly filming in Iran, and sent in CIA agents disguised as actors and directors, and like used this as a cover to like smuggle the American diplomats out of the Canadian embassy and back to America. And Argo was the name of the fake movie. Crazy story, true story. But for the vast majority of the people that were there in the American embassy, I mean, it was this tense thing, because these Islamic people have them, kidnapped, and we just don't know when they're going to lose everything and kill them all any day. And they've been holding them for all this time. You know, we don't want to negotiate with terrorists, because if you negotiate with terrorists, you get more people getting kidnapped. So we're trying to figure out what to do. We send U.S. Special Forces. We send Delta Force on an attempted rescue mission We sent 2 helicopters worth of troops. And darn it, if one of the helicopters doesn't catch on fire in midair, which leads to a crash landing. Thankfully, mercifully, no one was killed. I actually have met the man who was in charge of the operation. He was in the other helicopter. He was talking. He actually went to church with me for a little while, and he was talking about how he was watched the other helicopter catch on fire, and he was there in his helicopter praying, and no one died, which is crazy. But so no one died in the mission, but they also didn't get to rescue anybody. So the failed rescue made Carter look bad, whether it was his fair to blame him or not. But he couldn't get anything done about it. And what happens too. So when it comes time for him to run for election in 1980. Reagan during the campaign, who becomes the next president, is promising, listen, if the hostages aren't released on day one, we're basically going to war with Iran on the first day. I'm going to start bombing the crap out of Tehran. And sure enough, on day one, the day that Reagan is inaugurated, the hostages are released from Iran. And obviously, Carter's, people want to, give him credit that he worked diligently to the last day. Reagan's fans want to say that, well, he waited Carter out and then gave it to Reagan because he knew Reagan meant business. I think the truth is a little bit of both. Carter did work his fingers to the bone trying to work out a deal until his very last day in office when he could have been chilling. That is true. I want to give him credit for that. But I also think they released him because they knew that Reagan was serious in a way that I don't think they knew Carter was serious. I mean, to me, when you seize an American embassy and you have people held hostage for 6, 7, 8 months and you won't release, I mean, I think at that point you've officially, you've reached declaration of war status to me. I feel like if I'd been president in 1979, I feel like we would have gone to war with Iran, whether that was good or not. I don't know. But that's what I think would have happened. So this was a big crisis, and then simultaneous to that, I'm going to try to wrap this up here because I don't want to spend 50 minutes on Jimmy Carter's presidency. But one other thing that you got to understand during this time is simultaneous to all this, the economic stagnation that we talked about that was kind of plaguing America in the 1970s continues. In the last 4 years of the 70s, it continues from 77 to 80, which was the period of Carter's administration. But it actually gets worse. And so by the time Ford left office, they had managed to get uninflation down. So typically they want inflation to be around a steady 3%. That's what you kind of considered a healthy economy, is kind of about 3% a year inflation. Ford had fought really hard and gotten inflation down to about 5%, which is just a little worse than it should be. The consequence of that, though, was there was unemployment rising with that a little bit. And so by the time Ford leaves office, unemployment is at 8%, which is pretty bad. I think we're about there right now because of the corona thing, but or maybe even a little worse. But 2 months ago, it was like maybe 4.5%, something like that. So, by the time Carter is out of there, they've only dropped unemployment like 0.5%, from 8 to 7.5%. But inflation has skyrocketed from like 5% up to 13%, which 13% inflation is a big deal, because if people owe you money and there's 13% inflation, you've probably lost money on loaning them the money, because not only has the interest evened out, it's probably gone in the other direction. So you've lost money as a lender, which means that all the banks are in trouble, which means that they're not wanting to take on a bunch of loans. And if banks don't want to take off loans because they can't make money on the interest, then what that means is businesses can't expand, because very rarely do businesses have the cash on hand to, like, so say you own a restaurant, you want to open a new location that's going to hire 8 more waiters and 4 more cooks or whatever. Well, you typically are going to have to go to the bank and get a loan to do that, because it takes businesses a couple of years to start making money. Well, if the banks don't want to give out loans because they're not making money on loans because of the inflation, well, that means that you're not going to be able to expand. So it creates a lot of problems. So inflation is out of control. The economy is bad. America looks weak. This relatively podunk regime in Iran is pushing us around. The Soviets just waltz into Afghanistan, and we can't do anything about it. In every area except for the Camp David, Carter can't get his treaty signed, but he's trying to negotiate with the Soviets while this is going on. Other than the Camp David Accords, which is better than any other president has been able to do with Middle East peace negotiations, but it should also be said that had more to do with Egyptian politics than American. Other than that, Carter can't get anything fixed, and so there's more and more resistance to the Carter administration. And by the time that he leaves office in November of '79, like right on the verge of his reelection. So, because the reelection campaign year was 1980, by November of '79, there was a poll found Carter's approval ratings at 19%, meaning 4 out of 5 Americans disapproved of Carter's job performance. Now, as controversial a president as Trump has been, his support has never dropped below 36, 37. When Richard Nixon was in the middle of Watergate, he had higher approval ratings than Jimmy Carter at the end of 1979. So Jimmy Carter, while a wonderful human being, he's actually still alive. He's the oldest living ex-president. But I think he's still alive. Maybe did he die like last year, maybe? No, I think he's still alive. Borderline. Anyway, well, he's a great human being, but just was not cut out to be the commander-in-chief of America during the Cold War, and his economic policies weren't doing anything to really help the terrible economic situation. So he winds up going down as one of the weaker American presidents of recent times. So, however, happy days are going to be here again very soon, because the Gipper's about to arrive and save the day. And to that tale we shall turn tomorrow. Y'all have a good day.